At 11:47 p.m. on September 27, 1943, a middle-aged housewife named Marie-Madeleine Fourcade stood in a bathroom in Aix-en-Provence, removing every piece of clothing she wore. She was 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. The Gestapo had arrested her 3 hours earlier. They had placed her in a cell with walls of solid stone, a single barred window measuring 18 inches by 12 inches, and a door with a lock mechanism that dated to 1883. By 11:52 p.m., she had squeezed her naked body through those bars and dropped 23 feet to the street below. She landed on cobblestones, broke her fall with a shoulder roll she had practiced exactly once, and disappeared into the night. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade ran the largest intelligence network in occupied France, an organization called Alliance that the Gestapo had been hunting for 2 years. Her escape that night was not unusual. Across Europe, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of Belarus, thousands of ordinary people were doing extraordinary things. This is the story of how they built an invisible army. The resistance networks that emerged across occupied Europe between 1940 and 1945 were not romantic adventures. They were brutal, desperate, often short-lived organizations built by people who knew they would probably die. The survival rate for wireless radio operators in occupied France averaged 6 weeks from the moment they began transmitting. In Poland, the penalty for hiding a Jewish family was death by firing squad for every member of your household, including children. In Yugoslavia, German reprisal policies called for 100 civilian executions for every German soldier killed by partisans. People joined anyway. They joined in numbers that would eventually total hundreds of thousands of active resistance fighters, supported by millions of civilians who provided shelter, food, intelligence, and silence. The story begins with defeat. When France surrendered on June 22, 1940, in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I, it appeared that Nazi Germany had won the war. France, the nation that had fielded the largest army in Europe, had fallen in 6 weeks. Poland was gone, Denmark occupied in 6 hours, Norway conquered, the Netherlands overrun, Belgium surrendered. Great Britain stood alone, and its prospects looked grim. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler and his general staff began planning Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England. Victory seemed inevitable. What the Germans did not anticipate was that their victories contained the seeds of their eventual defeat. Every conquered nation became a potential battlefield. Every occupied city became hostile territory. Every collaborator was a potential double agent, and every civilian was a potential enemy. The earliest resistance networks formed almost spontaneously. In Poland, military officers from the defeated Polish army began organizing within weeks of the September 1939 invasion. By February 1940, these scattered groups had coalesced into the Związek Walki Zbrojnej, the Union of Armed Struggle, which would later become the Armia Krajowa, or Home Army. The man who would command this force was General Stefan Rowecki, codename Grot, which meant spearhead in Polish. Rowecki was 45 years old, a career officer who had fought in World War I and understood that Poland's only hope lay in surviving long enough for the Allies to return. Under his command, the Polish Home Army would grow to become the largest resistance organization in Europe, with an estimated 380,000 sworn members by 1944. The Polish underground operated under conditions that were unimaginably harsh. The German occupation of Poland was not a military administration in the conventional sense. It was a deliberate program of extermination and enslavement. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS, had stated the objective clearly in a speech to SS officers in October 1939. All Poles will disappear from the world. It is essential that the great German people should consider it as their major task to destroy all Poles. The Germans destroyed Polish schools, murdered Polish intellectuals, priests, and professionals, and deported millions to forced labor camps. Into this nightmare, the Polish Home Army built a complete shadow state. They established underground courts, schools, and universities. They published hundreds of underground newspapers. They created an intelligence network that would provide the Allies with some of the most valuable information of the entire war, including the first reports of German V-2 rocket testing at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. The intelligence operation alone was staggering in scope. By 1943, the Polish Home Army was forwarding approximately 1,200 intelligence reports per month to London. These reports included detailed information on German troop movements, industrial production, railway schedules, and military installations. One of their greatest achievements came in July 1944, when Polish agents recovered pieces of a German V-2 rocket that had crashed near the Bug River. Engineers from the Home Army examined the wreckage, took detailed photographs and measurements, and arranged for the components to be flown to London in a daring night operation called Operation Most 3, or Bridge 3. On the night of July 25, 1944, a Royal Air Force Dakota transport aircraft landed in a field near Tarnów in occupied Poland, picked up the rocket parts along with several Polish engineers, and flew them to Brindisi in southern Italy. The intelligence gathered from those components gave Allied scientists crucial insights into German rocket technology months before the V-2 began falling on London. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles to the south, Italy was developing its own resistance movement under very different circumstances. When Allied forces landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943, the Italian fascist government began to collapse. Benito Mussolini, the dictator who had ruled Italy since 1922, was arrested on July 25th on orders from King Victor Emmanuel III. The new Italian government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio began secret negotiations with the Allies. On September 8, 1943, Italy announced its surrender. The Germans, who had anticipated this betrayal, immediately implemented Operation Axe, the occupation of Italy. Within days, German forces had seized control of northern and central Italy, disarmed 650,000 Italian soldiers, and deported more than 600,000 Italian military personnel to labor camps in Germany and occupied Poland. The Italian resistance emerged from this chaos. Former Italian soldiers, political dissidents, anti-fascist intellectuals, and ordinary citizens formed partisan bands in the mountains and forests. The Comitato di Liberazione Nazionale, or National Liberation Committee, attempted to coordinate these disparate groups, but Italian resistance remained deeply fragmented along political lines. Communist partisans operated separately from Catholic brigades, which operated separately from monarchist groups, which operated separately from liberal democratic formations. Despite this disunity, by the spring of 1945, approximately 250,000 Italians were actively fighting as partisans, with many more providing support. The Italian partisans operated primarily in the mountainous regions of northern Italy, the Apennines, that formed the spine of the peninsula. One of the most effective commanders was Ferruccio Parri, codename Maurizio, a liberal anti-fascist who had been arrested and imprisoned by Mussolini's regime in 1927. Parri escaped from prison in 1943 and helped organize the Partito d'Azione brigades, which operated extensively in the Alpine regions near Switzerland. The partisans' tactics focused on ambushes, sabotage of German supply lines, and intelligence gathering for Allied forces advancing from the south. They blew up railway bridges, attacked German convoys, and provided guides for Allied prisoners of war attempting to escape through the mountains to Switzerland. The Germans responded with savage reprisals. The massacre at Marzabotto, a small village in the Apennines, south of Bologna, stands as one of the worst atrocities committed in Western Europe during World War II. Between September 29th and October 5th, 1944, troops from the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division Reichsführer SS, under the command of SS Sturmbannführer Walter Raeder, systematically murdered civilians in Marzabotto and surrounding hamlets. They were retaliating for partisan activity in the region. When the killing ended, 770 civilians were dead, including children and elderly people. The victims were shot, burned alive in their homes, or herded into churches that were then set on fire. Raeder would later be convicted of war crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment, though he was released in 1985 and died in Austria in 1991, never having expressed remorse. The Yugoslav resistance operated on an entirely different scale. When Germany, Italy, and their allies invaded Yugoslavia in April 1941, the country disintegrated in 11 days. The Yugoslav government fled, and the occupying powers divided the country into occupation zones and puppet states. But in the mountains and forests of this fractured nation, two separate resistance movements emerged, and they hated each other almost as much as they hated the Germans. The first was the Chetniks, royalist forces loyal to the exiled Yugoslav government, commanded by Colonel Dragoljub Mihailović. The second was the Partisans, communist guerrillas led by Josip Broz, who used the nom de guerre Tito. Tito was 49 years old in 1941, a former metalworker and trade union organizer who had spent years in Moscow during the 1930s. He was a survivor of Stalin's purges, a skilled political operator, and, as events would prove, a military commander of considerable ability. The partisans he led became the most effective resistance force in occupied Europe, eventually fielding an army of 800,000 fighters. This was not a guerrilla force in the conventional sense. By 1944, the Yugoslav partisans had evolved into a conventional military force with artillery, tanks provided by the Soviets, and even a small air force. The conflict between the Chetniks and partisans turned Yugoslavia into a three-way civil war overlaid on top of a war against the occupiers. The Chetniks were Serbian nationalists who wanted to restore the monarchy. The partisans were multi-ethnic communists who promised a new socialist federation. Both groups fought the Germans and Italians, but they also fought each other. The situation became even more complex when some Chetnik units began collaborating with Italian occupation forces against the partisans, reasoning that the communists posed a greater long-term threat to Serbia than the temporary presence of Italian troops. This collaboration would ultimately doom Mihailović. The British, who had initially supported the Chetniks, withdrew their support in 1943 and threw their backing behind Tito instead. British liaison officers parachuting into Yugoslavia reported that the partisans were killing far more Germans than the Chetniks, and appeared to be the only force capable of sustained resistance. One of those British officers was Fitzroy MacLean, a brigadier who led the British mission to Tito's headquarters in 1943. In his reports to Winston Churchill, MacLean described partisan operations with a mixture of admiration and shock. The partisans fought battles that resulted in thousands of casualties on both sides. The German Sixth Offensive in 1944, an operation involving 90,000 German and collaborationist troops, was intended to destroy Tito's forces in Bosnia. The offensive failed. The partisans retreated, suffered heavy losses, but survived as a fighting force. By the end of the war, Yugoslav resistance forces had suffered approximately 305,000 dead, but they had tied down dozens of German divisions that might otherwise have been deployed to defend Germany itself or to fight on the Eastern Front. In France, resistance took longer to develop and operated under constant pressure from two police forces, the German Gestapo and the French Vichy government's own security apparatus. The French police were often more dangerous than the Germans. They knew the local population, spoke the language fluently, and understood French society in ways German occupiers never could. Pierre Pouchot, Vichy's Minister of the Interior, had created special brigades specifically to hunt communists and resistance members. These French police units arrested thousands of resistors, many of whom were then handed over to the Germans for interrogation, torture, and execution. The early French resistance consisted of small, isolated cells that had minimal contact with each other. Security protocols demanded this isolation. If one cell was captured and its members tortured, they could betray only the handful of people they knew personally. This cellular structure saved lives, but made coordination almost impossible. The situation began to change in 1942, when Jean Moulin, a former prefect who had been smuggled out of France, returned as General Charles de Gaulle's personal representative. Moulin's mission was to unify the fractured resistance movements under de Gaulle's leadership and establish the Conseil National de la Résistance, the National Council of the Resistance. Moulin was 43 years old, a skilled administrator and a man of considerable personal courage. He had attempted suicide in 1940 rather than sign a German document falsely accusing French colonial troops of atrocities. He survived, bearing a scar on his throat that he covered with a scarf for the rest of his short life. Moulin parachuted back into France on January 1, 1942, landing near Salon-de-Provence in the dead of winter. Over the next 18 months, he traveled constantly, meeting with resistance leaders, negotiating between communist and non-communist factions, arranging weapons drops, and establishing communication networks with London. On May 27, 1943, he succeeded in bringing together representatives of 8 major resistance movements at a meeting in Paris. This was the founding session of the National Council of the Resistance. It was also Moulin's greatest achievement and, indirectly, the cause of his death. 3 weeks later, on June 21, 1943, Moulin attended a meeting of resistance leaders in a house in Caluire, a suburb of Lyon. The Gestapo raided the meeting. Someone had betrayed them, though historians still debate who. Moulin was arrested along with 7 other resistance members. He was taken to Gestapo headquarters in Lyon, where he was interrogated by Klaus Barbie, the head of the local Gestapo, a man whose brutality would earn him the nickname the Butcher of Lyon. Moulin was tortured for information about resistance networks. According to witnesses who survived, he revealed nothing. He died on July 8, 1943, while being transported by train to Germany. The official German report claimed he committed suicide. Medical evidence and witness accounts suggest he died from injuries sustained during torture. His body was cremated, and his ashes were later interred in the Pantheon in Paris, France's memorial to its greatest citizens. The networks Moulin had helped build survived his death. By 1944, the French resistance had grown into a significant military force. The Allies referred to these fighters as the French Forces of the Interior, or FFI, from the French Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur. Estimates of their strength vary, but by June 1944, probably 100,000 to 150,000 active fighters were operating in France, with many more civilians providing support. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, French resistance fighters executed Plan Vert, Plan Violet, and Plan Tortue, coordinated campaigns of sabotage, targeting railways, telecommunications, and roads. In the 48 hours following D-Day, resistance fighters cut railway lines in 950 locations across France. These cuts prevented German reinforcements from reaching Normandy during the critical first days of the invasion, when the Allied beachhead was most vulnerable. The resistance also paid a terrible price. In the village of Oradour-sur-Glane, or Adour-sur-Glane, 190 miles south of Normandy, German troops from the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich were moving north to reinforce the front. On June 10, 1944, they entered Oradour-sur-Glane, herded the population into the village square, separated men from women and children, machine-gunned the men in barns, and burned the women and children alive in the church. 642 people died. Only 6 people survived. The Germans claimed they were searching for a missing SS officer and punishing resistance activity. No resistance fighters were based in Oradour-sur-Glane. The massacre appears to have been a deliberate terror operation intended to discourage civilian support for the resistance. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane remain preserved today as a memorial. Nothing has been rebuilt. The burned-out cars still sit in the streets. The church tower still stands, blackened by fire. Across all occupied territories, the work of resistance took similar forms. Intelligence gathering was crucial, perhaps more valuable than armed action. Resistance networks identified German military installations, tracked troop movements, reported the locations of V-weapon launch sites, and helped Allied intelligence map German defenses. In Belgium, the Comet Line, organized by 24-year-old André de Jong, code name Dédé, smuggled Allied airmen shot down over occupied Europe back to Britain. The route ran from Brussels through France to the Pyrenees, then across the mountains into Spain. Between 1941 and 1944, the Comet Line helped more than 800 airmen escape. André de Jong herself personally escorted more than 100 airmen across the Pyrenees before she was arrested by the Gestapo in January 1943. She survived interrogation and concentration camps and lived until 2007. The resistance also maintained morale and cultural identity. Underground presses published newspapers, literary journals, and books. In Poland, the underground education system taught an estimated 1 million children during the war, preserving Polish language and culture in defiance of German attempts to eliminate it. In the Netherlands, where the Germans had banned all forms of public dissent, the underground newspaper Het Parool, meaning the watchword, circulated thousands of copies monthly, printed on clandestine presses that moved constantly to avoid detection. The editor, Frans Godehart, survived the war and became Minister of Justice in the post-war Dutch government. Radio operators were among the most vital and most vulnerable members of any resistance network. They maintained contact with London, coordinated weapons drops, and transmitted intelligence. The Germans used mobile direction-finding units to locate transmitters. These units, mounted in trucks that could drive through cities while triangulating radio signals, could identify a transmitter's location within minutes if the operator stayed on the air long enough. Resistance radio operators learned to transmit in bursts, moving constantly, never broadcasting from the same location twice. They averaged 30 to 45 seconds of transmission time before shutting down and disappearing. Even with these precautions, the casualty rate was devastating. Of the 470 wireless operators the British Special Operations Executive sent to France, 118 died in concentration camps or were executed. Women were disproportionately represented in resistance work, particularly in courier roles, though many also served as fighters, saboteurs, and network organizers. The Germans tended to be less suspicious of women, particularly middle-aged women or women traveling with children. Resistance networks exploited this prejudice ruthlessly. Women carried messages, weapons, explosives, and false documents hidden in shopping bags, baby carriages, and beneath clothing. Virginia Hall, an American working for the British Special Operations Executive, walked with a pronounced limp from a hunting accident that had cost her part of her left leg. She called her prosthetic leg Cuthbert. The Germans knew about her, circulated wanted posters describing her limp, and never caught her. She operated in France from 1941 until the Gestapo got too close in late 1942, then escaped by walking across the Pyrenees into Spain, a 60-mile trek through mountain passes in winter. She later returned to France in 1944, working for the American Office of Strategic Services, coordinating resistance groups in central France, calling in airstrikes, and organizing sabotage operations behind German lines. The resistance achieved victories, but it also suffered catastrophic losses. In the Netherlands, The Germans successfully infiltrated and destroyed major resistance networks through Operation North Pole, a counterintelligence operation that ran from 1942 to 1944. The operation began when two Dutch resistance members, Hubertus Lauwers and Thijs Taconis, were captured in March 1942. Under torture and threat of death, Lauwers agreed to continue sending radio messages to London, but he deliberately omitted his security check, a prearranged signal that would indicate he had been captured. London ignored the missing security check and continued sending instructions, weapons, and agents. Over the next 2 years, the Germans arrested 54 agents parachuting into the Netherlands, captured tons of weapons and supplies, and rolled up entire resistance networks. Lauwers, in his messages, tried repeatedly to warn London by including phrases and making mistakes that should have been obvious. London missed every signal. When British intelligence finally realized what had happened in 1944, 54 captured agents had been executed or had died in concentration camps. The question of whether armed resistance was militarily effective or simply provoked reprisals that killed more civilians than Germans remains contested. In some regions, particularly Yugoslavia and parts of the Soviet Union, partisan warfare tied down significant German forces and inflicted substantial casualties. The German Army Group E, responsible for the Balkans, had to keep approximately 600,000 troops in the region throughout 1943 and 1944, troops that might have made a decisive difference on other fronts. In other regions, particularly in Western Europe, the military impact was more limited, though the intelligence gathering and sabotage operations clearly aided the Allied war effort. The reprisals were real. For every German soldier killed by partisans in Serbia, the German command ordered 100 Serbian civilians executed. These reprisals were carried out systematically. The village of Kragujevac in Serbia lost approximately 3,000 civilians, including children, in reprisals conducted in October 1941. As Allied armies advanced in 1944 and 1945, resistance networks provided invaluable support. In Italy, partisans harassed German forces retreating north, attacked supply columns, and seized control of cities before Allied troops arrived. On April 25, 1945, partisan forces launched insurrections in Milan, Turin, and Genoa. In Milan, partisans captured Benito Mussolini and his mistress Clara Petacci as they attempted to flee to Switzerland. On April 28th, partisans executed them both, then transported the bodies to Milan, where they were hung upside down from the roof of a service station in Piazzale Loreto. Photographs of Mussolini's corpse, beaten and suspended by his ankles, circulated worldwide. It was a brutal end to a brutal regime, carried out by people who had suffered under that regime for more than 2 decades. In France, resistance fighters liberated cities ahead of Allied columns, or in conjunction with advancing forces. Paris rose in insurrection on August 19, 1944, days before Allied forces reached the city. For 6 days, resistance fighters and armed civilians battled German garrison troops. The German commander of Paris, General Dietrich von Choltitz, held orders from Hitler to destroy the city rather than allow it to be captured. He did not carry out those orders. On August 25th, French and American forces entered Paris. Von Choltitz surrendered, and General Charles de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées at the head of a liberation parade. The Free French 2nd Armored Division, which had fought its way from North Africa through Normandy to Paris, led the parade, but the resistance fighters who had kept the flame of French defiance alive through 4 years of occupation marched alongside them. The aftermath of resistance was complex and often dark. In France, the epuration or purification saw thousands of collaborators arrested, tried, and executed. Women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved and were paraded through streets while crowds jeered. The exact number of summary executions is disputed, but estimates range from 4,000 to 9,000. Legal executions following trials added another 767. In Italy, partisan justice killed an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 suspected fascists and collaborators in the chaotic final months of the war and immediate post-war period. Many of these killings were acts of revenge rather than justice. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans conducted mass executions of captured Axis troops and suspected collaborators. The massacres at Bleiburg, where Yugoslav forces executed thousands of Croatian, Slovenian, and Chetnik prisoners in May 1945, remain a source of historical controversy and grief. The Polish Home Army faced perhaps the cruelest fate. On August 31, 1944, with Soviet forces approaching Warsaw from the east, the Home Army launched an uprising intended to liberate the city before the Soviets arrived. The uprising was planned to last 3 to 5 days. It lasted 63 days. The Germans, rather than retreating as expected, reinforced Warsaw and systematically destroyed the city block by block. Soviet forces stopped their advance and waited on the east bank of the Vistula River while the Germans crushed the uprising. Stalin refused to allow British and American planes to use Soviet airfields to supply the insurgents. By the time the Home Army surrendered on October 2, 1944, approximately 16,000 resistance fighters were dead, along with an estimated 150,000 to 200,000 civilians. The Germans expelled the surviving population and spent the next 3 months demolishing what remained of the city, destroying an estimated 85% of Warsaw's buildings. When Soviet forces finally entered Warsaw in January 1945, they found ruins. The surviving members of the Home Army who remained in Poland were arrested by Soviet security forces. Many were executed or deported to the Gulag. General Leopold Okulicki, who had commanded the Home Army in its final months, was arrested by the Soviets in March 1945, tried for anti-Soviet activity, and died in prison in December 1946. For those who survived, the recognition came slowly and often inadequately. Many resistance fighters found themselves politically marginalized in post-war governments, particularly in Eastern Europe, where communist regimes viewed non-communist resistance members as potential threats. In Western Europe, resistance service became a badge of honor, though often the full story of what individuals had done remained classified for decades. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, who had escaped through prison bars and continued running Alliance Network until the liberation, wrote her memoirs in 1968. Virginia Hall received the Distinguished Service Cross from the United States, the only civilian woman to receive this award during World War II. The ceremony was conducted quietly, without publicity, because much of her work remained classified. André de Jong, who had saved 800 airmen, received the George Medal from Britain and the Medal of Freedom from the United States. She spent the rest of her life working with lepers in Africa, rarely speaking about her war service. The networks these people built created something unprecedented in military history, a form of warfare where the battlefield was everywhere, where the front lines ran through kitchens and bedrooms, where a woman carrying groceries might be transporting explosives, where a farmer listening to BBC broadcasts in his barn was conducting intelligence operations, where children serving as lookouts were soldiers. The casualty rates speak to the danger. The Polish Home Army lost approximately 34,000 dead during the occupation, not counting the losses in the Warsaw Uprising. French resistance networks lost an estimated 20,000 to 30,000, killed or died in concentration camps. Yugoslav partisans suffered 305,000 dead. Italian partisans lost approximately 35,000. These numbers do not include the civilian casualties from reprisals, the families executed for hiding fugitives, the villages burned in retaliation for sabotage. The question remains whether it was worth it, whether the military contribution justified the cost, in civilian lives? There is no comfortable answer. In purely military terms, resistance networks provided invaluable intelligence, tied down occupation forces, disrupted supply lines, and supported Allied operations. The intelligence the Polish Home Army provided about German rocket programs, the information French networks supplied about Atlantic Wall defenses, the guides Yugoslav partisans provided for downed Allied airmen, the railway cuts that delayed German reinforcements after D-Day, all these contributions measurably affected the course of the war. At the same time, the reprisals were real, the suffering was immense, and many civilians died who had no connection to resistance activities except living in the wrong village at the wrong time. What is certain is that the resistance represented something beyond military calculation. It was a refusal to accept defeat, a determination that occupation would never equal legitimacy, that the occupiers would never be able to turn their backs without looking over their shoulders, that there would always be someone listening, someone watching, someone waiting for the opportunity to strike back. In that sense, the resistance achieved something no military victory alone could provide. It preserved the dignity and identity of occupied nations during their darkest hours. When those nations finally emerged from occupation, they emerged as communities that had never stopped fighting, that had maintained their own parallel governments, their own schools, their own courts, their own armies in the shadows. They had lost, been conquered, occupied, but they had never surrendered. That, perhaps more than any tactical achievement, was the true victory of the underground resistance networks of World War II. They proved that armies can be defeated, but nations that refuse to accept defeat cannot be permanently conquered.